My love affair with Irvington began the day I moved in, February 19th, 1964. It snowed the night before, and John Arnold, my new neighbor, arrived with his snowblower and blew a path from the driveway to the door. Then the moving truck got stuck. We had to get some sand and salt, so we put 2 packing barrels in the trunk of Fred Streb's car, my real estate guy, and headed downtown. One of Irvington's finest was standing on Main Street, and I got out of the car and asked his advice, and he said, "Go straight toward the river, and you'll run into a big pile of sand and salt. But I wouldn't take too much, and I'd take it in a hurry." I said to myself, this is Irvington. This is my kind of place. A year or so later, I came home on an evening train with the streets covered with snow and started to walk home to Lewis Road. 2 policemen in a car came by and gave me the ride home, and I said, when police give you a ride home, this is the place for me. Raising my family in Irvington was terrific. The educators were exemplary. Ted worked with Michael Penta. Peter was a protege of Tom Johnson and Larry Corio. Jamie bonded with Dr. Powers. The highlight for me in Irvington was Memorial Day. Irvington resident Helen Ann Pastuca called me after 9/11 and said she'd written a song called "We the People." Mayor Flood said it could be sung at the ceremony on Main Street. Well, I don't know if you can imagine what it's like to stand there singing this song on Memorial Day and look out at the crowd of policemen, firemen, students, the high school band, and citizens on the sidewalk. I had the privilege of singing that patriotic song every Memorial Day for 10 years. It doesn't get better than that. Years ago, the tea house at Halsey Pond was crumbling, and the village was going to spend $2,500 to put a fence around it. We took that money, raised much more in a dollar-for-dollar agreement, and restored it and established Irvington Landmark Preservation. Another time, Mayor Flood told me that the statue of Washington Irving at the corner of Sunnyside and Broadway had turned green. We again raised money and hired an expert to restore it. You don't take a Daniel Chester French sculpture and use Brillo pads on it. My wife Betsy and I also helped with the creation and purchase of the Rip Van Winkle statue. We were 100% involved with the restoration of the building that would become McVicker House, which had been owned by Con Edison. It was in terrible condition, with vines growing both inside and outside the house. Con Edison wanted $50,000 for the house. I met with the Con Ed guy and told him I worked for ABC and that I'm going to put up a sign saying this house has been maintained by Con Edison and have the Eyewitness News truck film it. The guy turned pale, and they later sold it to the village for a more reasonable amount.
I moved to Irvington in 1964. My husband Andy and I, with our 15-month-old son, were looking for an apartment and thought we might like to live in the river towns. We drove up Broadway, and there was a vacancy at Woodbrook Gardens, and we took it. Lots of young mothers with toddlers, and right down the hill, in the same complex, there were 2 excellent pediatricians, Dr. Reed and Dr. Stiles. We outgrew that apartment and looked for our first house, and we found one in Jaffrey Park on the corner of South Ferris Street, and that's where we moved next. The kids used to be outside in the afternoons and evenings, boys and girls, all ages, just playing kickball and races and whatever. On the corner of our street was Pat's Exxon station, and also on the corner of Ferris and Main, there was a milk machine. I used to send my son up to get a quart of milk out of this machine for 27 cents. He took the quarter and 2 pennies and came back with his quart of milk. At the south end of Ferris Street, there was a path down to Station Road. Everybody called it the Rocky Road, and it was a great shortcut to Dow's Lane School or to Memorial Park. Rocky Road had its own sort of mystique, I think. In fact, one of my son's friends does country music, and he wrote a song about the Rocky Road, and he was heartbroken when he came back and realized it was gone. In 1973, we moved up to Park Road at the corner of Harriman. At that time, we had 4 children. My husband was disabled, so we had been looking for a house with no steps, and we found a great house there. And there were only 4 houses on Park Road. My kids loved hopping on their bikes in the morning and riding up to Halsey property. The kids went ice skating up there, and Mrs. Halsey would drive down to watch them. She drove on that path around the pond in her car. She was very hospitable about the kids using her place. They had a lot of fun exploring. One night I looked out my window and Halsey Castle was on fire, and it was traumatic. The flames, you thought they were going to just come right towards you. After the castle burned, the children used to go up and imagine that there were ghosts in the remains, and they had great fun making up stories. They'd see a curtain blowing in a window or something and think that was a ghost. And then the castle was torn down. So everything was different after that, but our kids could still go to the pond and have fun, and the pond is still there. But the whole street has changed, and for the better.
What was Irvington like in those years? It was the 70s and 80s. It had many aspects of small-town life that, even then, were vanishing elsewhere in America. The kind of place where, just to give the flavor of it, in the first year that we lived here, we knew that we wanted to try to buy a house. It was uncertain times, and we were new parents, and my job teaching at NYU was uncertain, but still we wanted to get started. And we did find a house in East Irvington, which probably was the least expensive house in the river towns. We were looking for financing and a mortgage, and we applied to Sunnyside Bank. A week or so after we put the application in, I was buying something in the Irvington pharmacy, unfortunately vanished now, and the proprietor said, "Yeah, I'm on the bank board, and your application came up the other night." And I still get emotional about this. And he went on, and I told them you're good payers, that you pay on time, and they should take that into account. And we'd just run a tab there at the drugstore, and at the end of each month they sent a written bill. It wasn't credit cards or anything, and that encounter gave one the sense that every interaction within the village tended to link in. A few years later we moved to the center village, which had even more of a small-town feel. We loved walking everywhere, and our kids played on the sidewalks and dead-end street. Our new location encouraged me to work on the library board for many years and on the restoration of the Tiffany Room. We worked with some wonderful people and soon realized that civic spirit, good taste, and public service could come together and do wonderful things. Irvington was very supportive with lots of easy interaction among families. That reminds me of a story about our third child, Catherine. She really disliked wearing winter hats, and we would say, "Catherine, you have to keep your head warm, so when you leave the house, wear your winter hat." Well, one day, and I think this was probably one day of many, as soon as she was on her way, she was like 6, and going down for the bus to go to school. And as soon as she turned the corner from Cottonette Street onto Main Street, she ripped off her hat because there she couldn't be seen from our house. But Bobby Vaught, who lived in Barney Park and walked down that very block each morning to get to the train, saw Catherine take her hat off. And then I saw him on the commuter train, and he said, "Oh, I just saw your daughter, and I see where she doesn't like winter hats." So that night at dinner I said, "So, Catherine, I hear that, when you turned the corner to Main Street, there went the hat." She looked at me as if to say, "How would you know that?" I said, "Well, it's a small town."
My husband Stanley found Irvington. I had never heard of it. We lived here from 1972 to 2005. We had a great Victorian house which was built around 1850. We loved it. We had loads of fun with it, lots of people coming to dinner parties, friends, family. There were 6 bedrooms. When the girls went off to college, we had all these empty rooms, so we went to Mercy College and rented them out to students because in those days they didn't have any dorms. You know, it occurs to me now, we never asked the village, was this all right? We had lots of wildlife here. There was a resident badger, and we were absolutely amazed to see how fast it could run. We had raccoons, of course, that lived in a big beech tree, which is no longer here. I don't know if it was that raccoon, but we were not home, but somebody was and told us that a raccoon came through the back door into the big kitchen, opened the refrigerator, helped himself to a package of bread, left the breadcrumbs all over the place, and left. How did I meet people? Well, in the beginning, I became a member of the League of Women Voters and also of the PTA. Stanley's passion was playing tennis, and there were 4 men who played. They called themselves the Dinosaur Team. They were not in the first blush of youth, although they weren't terribly old either. They consisted of my husband, Hillel Gedrich, Bernie Zuckerman, and Seymour Stein. They played, I think, every weekend in the tennis courts here in the park or wherever they could find a court free. Then I got involved with the Democratic Party when I lost my job. The chair of the Democratic Party at that time asked me if I would like to be a district leader since I had nothing to do, he thought. And without even knowing what a district leader is, I said fine. So what a district leader does a lot is go around getting people to sign petitions. And of course it had to be done either in February when there was a lot of snow or in July when it was awfully hot. But I got to walk around the neighborhood and got to see a lot of people and get signatures and hoped to do some good. People were really quite nice about it. Eventually, I became chair of the Irving Democratic Committee and held it together for a couple of years. I ran several times for the Board of Trustees, unsuccessfully, unfortunately, every time. We had a great time going around and presenting ourselves to people. At one point, I ran with Bob Phillipson, who lived in Hudson House, an awfully nice guy. He didn't get in either. We were unsuccessful, but we had a great time, and I think we accomplished some good things.
We had an overseas assignment for 18 months, living in Oslo, Norway, and Copenhagen, Denmark. I was working for a shipping company in the executive training program, and when that concluded, I was sent back to New York. We first lived in a small apartment on Staten Island. We were having our first child, and I said, "This is not for us. We need more space." We put a circle around New York City, and we said, anything within 25 miles is what we'll consider. So we went to Dobbs Ferry, to Hastings, and then we found Irvington. And we liked Irvington and bought the Thorndike's house. Herb and Sally Camp bought the house next door. Lang Stevenson lived across the street. I was commuting into the city, and there was a period when the West Side Highway collapsed. That's when I decided I would buy a boat to commute to the city. I kept it at the Tarrytown Yacht Club. If the weather wasn't great, I could take a cab home and leave the boat at the fireboat pier where it had 24-hour security. My first civic role came about because some guys that we got to know were concerned about development in the village. Bob Reisman, who was CFO of American Cyanamid, and Bill Roy were a part of this. Reggie Mara and 1 or 2 other people as well. We were asked if we would run to bring in a new board of trustees because there was a certain level of dissatisfaction with the incumbents. I always thought Bob Reisman was the most talented mayor we ever had. I was one of the trustees and eventually became the deputy mayor. I was one of the newly elected trustees. I was a trustee all told for 16 years. It was a wonderful group of people, and we seemed to feed off each other's ideas and experiences. We had a lot of public works projects, the new water tank and the new sewer plant. So we went after a lot of federal grants. Scenic Hudson Park, which Scenic Hudson, the environmental group, first turned down because they wanted a more passive, not an active park. But we made a special appeal, headed by Garrett Beatty, and they reversed their decision. We lost our dear friend and neighbor, Elfie Bernhardt, a very caring, giving person who was killed by her au pair's acquaintance. There was a big investigation, and nobody went home until they found him. Throughout my career, my village career, almost became paramount. Your oath and call to civic duty depends on what's going on.
My sister, Kathy Elfers, preceded me to Irvington by about 5 years and taught at Dow's Lane for 30 years. Before I came in 1972, our family would ride from Riverdale and watch my nephews play CYO basketball at Immaculate Conception and football and baseball games at Memorial Field. We fell in love with the town and the school. We moved to Willow Lane in East Irvington into an old farmhouse built in the mid-1800s. It is still there. The people on the street were wonderful. My boys immediately had friends. We would all go to the end of the street where the kids would get on the bus, and then the mothers would go back to have coffee. When the kids came home, they'd get on their bikes and ride to the East Irvington School and into the woods, which are now the O'Hara Nature Center. Later, we moved to Riverview Road. Soon after moving, I began serving on the Recreation Commission. I did that for 15 years and worked with wonderful people like Bill Zimmerman and Joe Archino. My husband Neil, Peter Oley, and I started Sunnyside Attract for younger children. The first year we had 50 kids. The second year we had over 200. The Recreation Department also brought in ballet and art for children and became very involved in the Senior Citizen Program. We initiated the Peter Oley Turkey Trot, and my whole family ran. The commission was a great group, and it was a big part of my getting away from coaching and seeing other people in other parts of the town. Of course, the Irvington schools were central to my life in Irvington. My 2 boys went to Dow's Lane, the Main Street School, and the high school, and received not only incredible education, but also made lifelong friends. The teachers were amazing, and my boys are still in touch with many of them. And now my 2 grandchildren are going to the same schools and loving every minute of it as well. My family also attended Immaculate Conception Church, where I met so many friends. The DeRoses, the Knowleses, the Maccas, the Bokikios, and the Sweeneys. It turns out Maureen Sweeney and I played basketball against each other in high school. And she also lived in Riverdale and knew I had coached. That first weekend I was in church, Maureen said, "They are looking for a high school CYO coach. Will you do it?" I said, "Sure." And that's how I began coaching in Irvington. The village has been incredibly good to our basketball program. They've allowed us to start a summer league through the recreation department with the school's cooperation. It's definitely helped me build a program, which I think of as a family, our family. We believe that once you're part of this family, you join the generation of players who hold the symbolic rope, which connects all of us as one community. It's persisted because the families and the town have bought into it. Irvington has been there for me and my family, always, in good times and tough times. The town really rallies better than any village I've ever encountered. That's why I love it. It's the people. That has not changed. We all may have different points of view, and we're all more conscious of these differences now, and that's a good thing. We should have different points of view, and we do need to listen to each other. Ultimately, that's what it's all about, supporting one another. That's really been, in my opinion, the mantra of Irvington, and hopefully it will be that way forever. We're very lucky to be here.
1850s Ireland was a mess. Thomas Murphy, my great-great-grandfather, a stonemason, came to Irvington from County Clare via Tredegar in Wales on a ship that landed in Philadelphia in 1854. Thomas began building stone houses and walls. From Main Street to the Tappan Zee Bridge, every stone wall on both sides of Broadway were his contracts. His son, also Thomas, went into the same masonry business. They built the Immaculate Conception Church on Broadway in 1873. The reservoir on Harriman Road was also built in 1900 by my great-grandfather. My father and all of his brothers volunteered for World War II, all but one serving overseas, 2 in combat, all returning. Born in Texas, where my father was stationed with the Army Air Corps, my earliest recollection of Irvington was hearing my father say, "When we see the George Washington Bridge, we'll know we're nearly home." Mother and I moved in with the McBrides at 17 North Cottonette Street when Father was sent to the Far East. Walter's dog, Duke, adopted me. After kindergarten, I went daily upstairs at 108 Main Street to Mrs. Mafucci's kitchen. There was usually a pot on her stove with red sauce bubbling. Good things always. Always came out of it. Her son, Joseph Mafucci, was my big brother. The Tuohys and the Murphys have been good friends since 1854. Jane Davis Murphy and Mrs. Tuohy jointly owned a cow. Village historian Wolfert Lockwood told me that my great-great-grandmother and Mrs. Tuohy were fined $5 in 1872 by the new village court. Their cow had broken loose, grazing on Main Street in violation of a new village ordinance, and the 2 women with brooms had assaulted the entire cow-arresting police force, which consisted solely of Constable Templeton. Later, Irvington had 18 policemen, including Roger Fallon, who later became chief. Dick Tuohy was notable for the way he would walk his beat at night on Main Street, observing everything. And Bobby Tuohy always called me cousin. All the garbage men, the G-men, had real personalities, most notably Willie Raiola of Hawaiian War Chant fame, true community assets. School was East Irvington, then Pennybridge, then Main Street, built by my great-grandfather Thomas Murphy. In 1955, as the old Tappan Zee Bridge was being built across the Hudson River, visible from Miss Emily Petrie's 6th grade classroom in the Main Street School, she asked her class of some 30 students to raise a hand if either or both parents had served in uniform during World War II. Every hand but one was raised. The exception was David Smith, whose father was the much-beloved Dr. Chesley Smith, whose home and office were at 118 Main Street just above the aqueduct. The class agreed unanimously that the village could not have done without him during the war. As Boy Scouts, we camped at Cock-Robin Farm and in the Upwoods. A really interesting job I had in Irvington was as a supplementary letter carrier assisting Anthony Costello. My part, everything on foot, Main Street, the side streets, and the houses north of Dutcher Street. 2 ladies independently said to me, "If you bring in the mail and put it on the kitchen table, there's a hot cup of tea in it for you." Leonard Genzano, that is Lenny the barber, was a fixture in the village for decades. When I was hospitalized for 8 weeks, Lenny said to my dad, "I'll be happy to go to the hospital and give him a haircut." My father said no. When I left the hospital, Lenny gave me the haircut, but refused to take any money until he thought I looked healthy. Another example of how kind Irvington people were.
I was born in Peekskill, New York, but grew up in Elmsford, attending Alexander Hamilton Public Schools. Following graduation, I worked at AT&T in White Plains. In 1957, I met my future husband, Greg Smith, and we married on September 13, 1959. My husband, knowing so many people who lived in Irvington, decided we should move there. We lived for 5 years at 14 South Broadway, moving in 1964 to the Smith family home on Main Street, and then moving back to South Buckout Street in 1988. We made friends right away. I was friends with a lot of people Greg knew. My husband worked for the village of 38 years, and everybody knew him. He passed away in November 2001, shortly after 9/11. His father had a liquor store on Broadway and was mayor back in the 40s. He had the corner luncheonette, which they would keep open for kids after basketball games. Everybody called it Dunks. I remember there used to be a woman's clothing store on Main Street, and there was another one up the hill, owned by the Stovers. We used to do a lot of shopping at two Irvington stores called one the Sample Case and Stretchini's. My husband's cousins, Bob, Helen, and Florence Stewart, who lived on South Continent Street, had the flower shop on Upper Main Street by the barber shop. I remember when Florence and Helen passed away, I went to their wakes in the house on Continent Street. Years ago, before I met my husband, there were other relatives of my husband's who were also waked in the Main Street house. And then there was a nice jewelry store which was attached to our house. It used to be my husband's grandfather's carpenter shop. When my husband and I married and came here to live, we were both working, and then I had my son Duncan Greg Smith III. I also raised my sister Kathleen, who moved in with us at the Main Street house as my mother was ill with cancer and lived to see her graduate from high school in 1975. My mother-in-law had dementia, and I also took care of her. Sadly, my son became ill with a brain tumor and passed away in November of 2020. I was a Girl Scout leader when my sister was growing up, and we used to love going to the Alibi for dinner. It was a great hangout for the village, and there used to be a nice little restaurant on Astor Street that closed, and an old apartment building which is now a condominiums. I remember everybody would get together on the holidays and pack up and go to Matheson Park and spend the day there and wait for the fireworks on the 4th of July.
We moved to Irvington from New York City in 1965. We had lived in Bayside, Queens, but I wanted to have a place in the city, closer to my work as a commercial photographer. I told my wife, Vanda, that we were moving too fast. I'd rather have a home than live in the city. Our interior decorator said, "Why don't I take you up to Ardsley, Irvington, Dobbsbury, and Tarrytown, near where I live?" When I first went, I was amazed how beautiful Irvington was. The undulating hills and trees. I went back to the same area, up and down the hills, until I saw a real estate sign there, and I called up the builder, Ray Caduzzi. He showed me what he was doing with different locations. I selected one I thought would be good, overlooking the Hudson River. It was country life for me. It was so beautiful. We became friendly with our neighbors. My wife was speaking to one of them, Pat Kennedy, and said that though we love it here, when we were living in Bayside, we'd always go to the Jones's Beach during the summertime. So Pat suggested that we join the Ardsley Country Club. They had a pool, golf, and a curling club there also. It seemed like something we should do. We met with the admissions committee, and right there on the spot, they accepted us as members. And that was it for me, to have access to the pool, golf, curling, and different programs they had. Another neighbor on Riverview Road, Warren McKenzie, also belonged to the club. He was in the oil business. There was an opening night for the members to attend. I asked Warren if I could go with him, and we started to play golf regularly. Eventually, I was asked to join the board of the club. Herb Camp was president at that time, and he had plans for enlarging the club. I became interested in that and worked together with Herb and Tony Cuccinello. When Harvey Appel became president, he wanted to reestablish Tally-Ho as the club's publication and asked me if I would head that up. I agreed because I'm very familiar with art, design, composition, and things like that. I must say, that turned out to be one of my most enjoyable accomplishments. There was another person, Herb McIntosh, who was a corporate officer of Brooks Brothers, and we became very good friends. His wife, Jean McIntosh, was speaking to my wife about curling, and before I knew it, my wife said, "Tony, we're going to become members of the Artie Curling Club." And that was the beginning of my learning how to curl. Jean and Herb McIntosh would always invite us to the Nutmeg Curling Club up in Connecticut to enter a yearly bonspiel, which is when all the curlers get together to compete.
Often when Judy woke our daughter from her nap, Amanda would ask, "Mommy, why doesn't she say hi to me? She just says this, wiggling her hands." Obviously the imagination of a toddler. But at age 10, Amanda screamed, "This is the same woman in the rocking chair I saw and still do when I peek in at night." She had discovered Isabel Benjamin's book From Dawn to Twilight, which had a photo and comment that both Mrs. Benjamin and Junior and Senior loved to knit in the rocking chair. Thus began our awareness of St. Barnabas ghosts. As a volunteer with the ambulance corps for 8 years, I initially raced off wearing my clerical collar until I learned that people being transported in the rig thought they were dying. Off came the collar. A scene in the Devil's Own movie with Brad Pitt and Harrison Ford was filmed at St. Barnabas. Brad Pitt asked if he could visit with our school kids downstairs. He played games and danced with them, sat on the floor telling his childhood stories. He was genuinely warm and natural, with everyone enjoying the fun. When Abbott House lost its school to a huge fire one year, St. Barnabas invited them to use our buildings, grounds, and facilities. 2 successful years led to my being invited on the board, which also included Malcolm X's wife. 9/11 was a scary time. I was asked by the village to say a prayer at a big gathering in our park. The Reverend Franklin Graham had just publicly announced that Islam was an evil religion. I countered that by saying we needed to bring people of the 3 Abrahamic faiths together. My friend Rabbi Barry Cantor of Dobbs Ferry and I joined with Dr. Mahajabeen Hassan, a physician in Phelps Hospital, to establish the Center for Jewish Christian Muslim Understanding. Our many successful activities were profiled by the press, TV, and even members of Congress. That dialogue was and continues to be precious. Irvington was a great place to raise our children. While they did not attend Irvington High School, all were thoroughly involved with our village. Judy and daughters had the family paper route business for many years. The kids were in theater productions, St. Barnabas sales, Sunday school activities. Our yard was full of kids. I was the drug counselor chair, played parts in the theater. Judy chaired the Experiment for International Living Committee, and we loved it all. The warmth and dynamic life of Irvington and St. Barnabas brought all of us joy, fun, support, and challenge. I was offered a number of rectorships over the years, but none compared to our very wonderful life at St. Barnabas in Irvington.